Tonight we are thinking about 9/11, and ICJS is a nonprofit that's committed to dismantling religious bias and bigotry. And I would argue that there has probably been no single greater contributor to religious bias and bigotry in the 21st century than 9/11 and its aftermath. A lot of commemorations have been going on over the last week, marking this 20th anniversary. And the angle that we'd like to focus on this evening is 9/11's impact on the interreligious and interfaith landscape of America. So we have on our call tonight all four of the ICJS scholars. I'll be hosting and introducing them as we go along. But all four of us are scholars who work in this field of interreligious Abrahamic dialogue. All four of us gained our graduate degrees after 9/11. So we're going to spend the first half of our time tonight, maybe the first 20 minutes or so, reflecting on how 9/11 shaped each of us, our personal, our academic and professional journeys that led us in this work, and kind of our observations of that landscape as we entered into it. And then after that, we want to spend some more time thinking about the lingering effects of 9/11 that we're still dealing with 20 years later, and what impact it's still having on the interreligious future that we're trying to build. So we'll keep everyone on mute for the full hour here, but please feel free to put your questions or introduce yourself in the chat, and feel free at any point to dump a question in the chat, and we'll make sure that there's especially time to answer questions at the end. So I'm going to start off by sending the first question to Zainab. Zainab Sailgan is our Muslim scholar here at the ICJS. She has been with us for over a year now. And Zainab, you were in Egypt on 9/11, if I recall correctly, and I know you have family in Germany, and you grew up in Germany, and you have family in Turkey. So I'm curious for your experience of 9/11 and its aftermath being outside of the US. And what has it been like entering into the American Muslim community that has been itself living through this aftermath?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And again, a warm welcome to everyone who joins us tonight. Yes, I was in Egypt at that time with a group of fellow Muslim students from Germany, and we were taking Arabic language classes there. It was a large mixed group of Muslims who came from Lebanese, Egyptian, Moroccan, Turkish, and myself, Kurdish background. So I remember we were in a restaurant in Cairo when everyone stood up staring at the TV screen, and there was just this collective moment of shock and silence and utter disbelief that this was truly happening. Afterwards, I remember our tour guide reaching out to us, gathering us for a conversation, and there was a deep sense that we had to be extra vigilant in the future for our own safety. And that remained true because all of a sudden, as Muslims, we were now incredibly visible on everyone's radar and more vulnerable. And just like many Muslims, I felt that immediately after my return to Germany. At the airport, I was picked out for random TSA screenings, extra body searches, something that continues to this day. And I would say as a Muslim, I'm always aware of the role that fear plays. Fear for my own safety, because Islamophobia is real here in the United States and in Europe. A few Muslim friends of mine who are wearing the headscarf shared with me that they were physically attacked in public. And thankfully, these painful experiences remain rare, but they're happening for these reasons. But also the awareness of others being afraid of me when I enter the elevator, an airplane, or sensing this climate of suspicion when I enter a classroom. I remember when I was hired at one teaching institution that a person reached out to the dean complaining why they had allowed a Muslim terrorist to serve on the faculty. And I eventually reached out to the person, invited him to campus, and have an opportunity to meet and talk to him. This did not play out, unfortunately, but I tried to channel my energy in constructive ways and my frustration with that. To your second question, Matt, I think as someone who entered the American Muslim community in 2004, so after 9/11, I would say that the American Muslim community has built an incredible resiliency throughout all these years. I mean, imagine literally overnight, they had become the enemy of the state in the name of national security. Constitutional rights were limited, increased surveillance, deportations, hostility, discrimination in all areas of their daily lives. So Muslims are sadly familiar with that. And that's not an American Muslim experience only. That is also one that I'm still familiar with in my own context in Germany and from friends who are coming from other European countries as well. So when I began my studies at Hartford Seminary, which is known for interreligious studies, some faculty shared that they had never seen so many Muslim students enrolling into their programs, pursuing educational leadership roles in the community, and becoming more skilled in interreligious engagement. I think there was a sense that the Muslim community had to step up and guide their communities in building interfaith alliances, share their own personal stories and narratives as mainstream society. And as horrific as these events were, I think they have also resulted in some strong, powerful interfaith friendships, alliances, and many Muslims became politically and socially more active as well. I know, Matt, you grew up as an evangelical Christian. So what impact did 9/11 have on your own religious and intellectual journey that led you to where you are today?
I did grow up evangelical. I'm an ex-evangelical, as they say. So I was actually at a leadership retreat for my evangelical campus ministry. I was in college on 9/11. So processed it very much from within my own evangelical framework. There was a good deal of Islamophobia mixed in there, although I was a religious studies minor. So it was not kind of an unnuanced Islamophobia. It was tailored to the particularities of my upbringing. And then I really remained within evangelicalism for a good decade after 9/11. I even went into evangelical ministry, and in 2003 and also 2006, I went to Turkey, actually to your family's homelands, on a missions trip, on 2 missions trips to try to convert Muslims. I was incredibly unsuccessful at it. What I realized in the process of going on those trips, though, was I really liked talking to Muslims. And over time, as I kind of oozed out of evangelicalism, I realized I was fascinated with Islam, but I didn't want to convert Muslims. I wanted to converse with them. And I became, in my own way, a convert to dialogue. And so I wound up, after I finished my seminary degree, trying to get a PhD in Islam, and wound up at our alma mater, Zainab, at Georgetown, working on Islam and Muslim Christian relations. And as I was studying Islam, I discovered that I was having all these experiences of deja vu, particularly when I was listening to this one community of Muslims, the Salafi Muslims. Mm-hmm. And it just resonated with my evangelical background. And so I wound up writing my dissertation, and now I've written a book about some of the parallels between evangelical Christians and Salafi Muslims, which a lot of people have observed parallels, but it's tended to be they're all just Muslim and Christian fundamentalists. And I actually think that there's some really interesting positive connections between them. In fact, in America, the Salafi community has been, as you said, incredibly resilient after 9/11. Al-Qaeda was and is a jihadi Salafi organization, but most Salafis are peaceful, kind of quiet people who want to just live their pious lives in seclusion from most of the rest of society. But Salafis in America have become incredibly integrated and even developed all kinds of friendships with evangelicals and other Christians and Jews. And so it's kind of been retrospectively, I've done a ton of work on 9/11 that I never anticipated on the day of. So Ben, speaking of scholarship on 9/11, you do not do scholarship on 9/11. Your specialization is in 19th and 20th century German Jewish philosophy. So 9/11 isn't directly the stuff that you work on, but I'm curious, how has 9/11 affected your work and your experiences these past 20 years?
So I do German Jewish thought and in intellectual history, and it actually strangely impacted me a great deal because I did have to learn German to do this work. And I spent many summers at Middlebury's language school to learn German. And the interesting thing about learning German there is that you get academics, you also get State Department people, lots of different professionals that are going to go and learn the language. So my first roommate was an FBI agent, and he was learning German so that he could surveil Muslims in Germany, because as he explained to me, and I say as he explained, his German wasn't as good at the time. So from what I was able to piece together, his goal was to prevent terrorist attacks before they happen, and that he was working with other security agencies, but that German was an important language. So instead of spending my summer talking about Goethe and Schiller and all the great works of German literature, I was talking about the security state. The following summer, the CIA was interviewing for positions. So even through grad school, this idea of a threat was impacting something like language studies, and a language that was not traditionally understood as a Muslim language. When I got my first job at Virginia Tech, several things happened that actually changed the course of my whole career and moved me into the area of interreligious dialogue. I'd spent many years studying the philosophy of dialogue and writing on the philosophy of dialogue. But it wasn't until I was in Blacksburg, Virginia, that I really started to think about how you do this practically. Within the first week that I moved there, my neighbors called the police on us for a noise complaint, because an Israeli family that we met was over having lunch. And to make a long story short, they thought that we were speaking Arabic. And so I had a surreal conversation with a police officer as to why speaking Hebrew or Arabic shouldn't really be cause to talk about the police, or talk to the police. Although I was excited at first when he wanted to know whether or not Arabic and Hebrew are similar, because I do specialize in language. So I talked about morphology and false friends, and sort of lost him. But the second part was that everyone that I talked to in a place where the biggest mass shooting had happened several months before was more afraid of Muslims. And I kept hearing that their values are not like ours, our Judeo-Christian values. And that word kept coming up, Judeo-Christian. And yet I was also experiencing a lot of anti-Semitism in Blacksburg, Virginia, with swastikas, nasty notes, being the director of Jewish studies. And so I didn't understand what the Judeo was and the Christian and what people were talking about, and it became more euphemistic. So I started to research the term Judeo-Christian, held a conference on it, edited a journal that Heather participated in. And it was all in the wake of this Islamophobia that I started to think about a new career. I want to engage people in dialogue in a way that's more meaningful. And so the circumstances of 9/11 changed my research dramatically.
And Heather, as our Roman Catholic scholar, if I recall, you were transitioning into graduate school at the point of 9/11, right? You were moving to do graduate school in England when 9/11 happened. So and you were going to work on Jewish-Christian relations, kind of similar to what Ben was just talking about. So how did you get drawn into this whole Abrahamic conversation in the process?
Yeah, so I graduated from Georgetown with my bachelor's in May of 2001. And sort of for background context, I'm a lifetime Catholic schoolgirl. So this is, from elementary school through college, I was in the Catholic education bubble. And I had decided to go to the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies for a one-year graduate diploma. And so this was sort of my first entry outside of the Catholic educational landscape. And I was slated to go and fly out of Boston. I was living in Connecticut with my parents at the time, about 10 days after 9/11. And so ended up on one of the first international flights that was sort of going out of the country at the time. And I was just talking about this with my parents this week, that they recall dropping me off at Logan Airport, and the security apparatus wasn't quite in place at that point. And so only ticketed passengers were even allowed to get out of their car, and you had to sort of show, and I remember all of the sort of armed security there to get out of the car to go. And the flight itself, there was, you know, the 747, there was probably 20 or 30 people on the whole plane at the time. And so it was a really a climate of fear and apprehension that I began my graduate school studies in England. And so my kind of expansion beyond the Catholic bubble into the world of Jewish studies and Jewish thought and Jewish language was always in the shadow of 9/11. And as Ben said, the sort of my awareness of the real prevalence and the growth of the term Judeo-Christian and this idea of a Judeo-Christian alliance, it was really something that in that sort of first 10 years, right? So we're at the 20-year mark. That first 10 years, I think I had an intellectual and personal journey, really just questioning the use of that term and what's going on there, and thinking about the kind of clash of civilizations thesis, and realizing that historically, again, the volume that Ben was talking about, that we wrote with colleagues together, that historically the Jewish Christian conversation was sort of developed in that term Judeo-Christian to separate the American West from the communists, right? So it was always a kind of an exclusionary term. There's this Judeo-Christian West, and then there are the communists over there. And now it seems that the term Judeo-Christian was being used to push out Islam and push out Muslims. And so it's kind of a false inclusion that's actually a term of exclusion. And so really just thinking about the project of Jewish-Christian relations and how in some ways it could be co-opted into sort of Islamophobic forms of exclusion. So being very conscious of that and aware of that. Another dynamic that I think over the last 20 years that I've become more aware of is really the sort of what I'll call the like good religion, bad religion trap. And how right after 9/11, there was really the sense of the hijackers weren't real Muslims, or that they were bad Muslims, and we have good Muslims over here and bad Muslims over there. And again, kind of reflecting back on growing up Catholic, I came of age in a Catholic educational system during the child abuse crisis within the church. And so very personally and intellectually aware that our religious communities have a tremendous capacity to do great harm in the world. And that those moments are moments where we need to sort of repent and repair. But our religious communities also have the capacity to do great good in the world and can call us towards sort of a more just future. And so really just being aware of this kind of good religion, bad religion trap, and trying to make sure that religions and the stories we tell about religions are complicated, and that we have to kind of extend the conversation beyond that. So those questions really animated me.
And we see the good religion, bad religion trap even this year after all these Christians stormed the Capitol on 1/6, and many Christians said, oh, those aren't real Christians, or those are bad Christians, right? This desire to draw a line that protects the religion in some cases, or that kind of negates the religion in some cases. But we're trained in graduate school to be able to hold the complexity of all the things that go on under the heading of religion.
Yeah, and maybe just also on that point, Matt and Heather, I think also from an Islamic theological perspective, there is always this, understanding that human beings or human nature has this dual aspect. You can be a constructive person, but at the same time, you have also the potential to be destructive, and to say, I am just good. I mean, this is just a very limited approach, at least from a Muslim theological perspective, that each and every human being has the potential to do good, but also to do bad, and so definitely from the early reactions within the Muslim community, these are not the right Muslims, or Islam is a religion of peace, does not really solve the problem, although I understand that, we wanted to distance ourselves from these type of horrific actions. But I think it was just, it was not sufficient to really address the real issue.
So I'm going to pose some more general questions, and I'll kind of just throw them out for our whole panel and let folks react to them as they see fit. I guess I would start off with thinking about kind of how American society has processed the Islam aspect of 9/11. And do you think that Americans in general, I realize that's a big category, but do you think that Americans in general are more literate about Islam today than they were 20 years ago?
That's a tough one, because, you know, as someone who has been invited as a Muslim scholar to so many various speaking engagements for the past 10 years or so, from my limited experience, I can say that the questions I receive about Islam and Muslims remain sadly similar. And in many educated forums, you can talk about any topic, you will still receive the same questions related to Muslim extremism, oppression of women, as if Muslims have a monopoly on that, and so forth. So somehow people are trapped in a certain cycle and narrative, and it's hard to break out of it and make room for other voices to be heard. And as an educator, I often ask a new audience what their first experience of Islam and Muslims was, positive or negative, and 90% answer was 9/11. It's understandably very difficult for people to step away from these horrific images and allow for a more multifaceted and nuanced learning experience. I would say that people need to confront their own negative perceptions, and that it takes relationship building to change these negative stereotypes about Muslims. But the frustration for me comes sometimes I'm asking myself, how do we break out of that cycle? How do we allow for a more nuanced learning experience? Because we seem to always ask, educated people always ask the same questions, even if you talk about a very specific topic. It's always, what about, you know, Al-Qaeda? What about extremism and women's oppression and so forth?
From the way that I broach it, there's a historical perspective, at least from the Jewish-Christian relationship, that I think is helpful when we talk about literacy. A lot of people have access to information. So how do you parse that information? How do you understand it? What's the purpose for it? And ultimately, what narrative is it going to fill? The first book ever written about Jewish history was written by a monk who was a supersessionist, and he wrote it to show that Jews are barbaric, that Jews don't understand their own scripture. The history of Jews is one of uncivilized behavior and one that doesn't have a spirit that's worthy of cultivation. And so there were a lot of people who were literate. This was a book that was widely read. I would remind all of us that the second most published book in the history of the world is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's still widely read today. Would we say that people who read that are literate? They're getting some access to what they perceive to be a Jewish point of view. We know it's a forgery. There's 40, 50, 60 years of scholarship that shows how this document was constructed, but people are going to believe it. So in terms of literacy, I would pose the question, what's our orientation to the information we want to process? So like what Matt and Heather we're talking about, the good and bad religion. Rather than making an assessment on the religious community at all, try to understand the nuance that you apply to your own life, to your own cultural memory, to your own understanding of history, and take into account, like what Zainab is saying, particular Muslim experiences to that. There's a whole wide range of literature on Islam that's written by Islamophobic authors whose purpose is to demonize Islam. Entire libraries can be filled with these works, and indeed some people line their libraries with them. So I want us to make sure that when we talk about literacy, we're also understanding a form of ideology, because the dialogical orientation that Zainab is describing takes more than just having access to things like the 5 pillars of Islam or the favorite passages in the Quran that people often come and cite back to us. That the religion is something lived and contextual. But to be literate in Islam is a lot more than we tend to give credit for.
Well, and I have found in speaking about Islam in many church spaces and many seemingly literate spaces that there's a sort of toxic literacy that people often have about Islam, where they've been very selective in the literacy that they've gained, and it's entirely come through kind of a security studies lens of like analyzing Islam as a security threat. I mean, David Brooks wrote a column in The Atlantic, I think it was just a couple of weeks after 9/11, saying, "I'm putting Ibn Taymiyyah on my reading list." I'm like looking back at that, like, why would you put an obscure 14th century thinker on your reading list? Sure, he happens to be somebody who is referenced by jihadi Muslims quite a bit, but why not just go talk to a Muslim, right? Why not just go engage actual Muslim communities? What new things is David Brooks going to gain from reading something about which he has no knowledge or background? How is that going to actually help him understand the contemporary Muslim community? So I mean, I think there's this way that people have said, "Oh, I've read a bunch of books about Islam," and my question always back to them is, "Well, how much did you talk to Muslims about those books?" Because those might not be Muslim books. There often are. There's all kinds of books written about Muslims that are coming from this kind of hostile security angle that want to try to force all these questions that Zainab's raising to the top of the queue, as opposed to maybe more native questions that Muslims themselves ask about themselves.
To kind of continue this conversation, I know, Zainab, this is something you and I have talked about a lot, thinking about the sort of institutional identity of the ICJS and the dynamics of interreligious dialogue. Like we've talked about when we go into spaces and are serving on panels or whatnot, but I'm also conscious, especially with the folks on the call tonight, that a lot of times we have breakout tables and breakout rooms at ICJS because we want to facilitate these interreligious contacts and these interreligious conversations. That's sort of a part of who we are as an organization. But I'm conscious of the fact that so many Muslim participants are sort of pushed into an apologetic mode, or that they go into small groups and feel like they have to say, like, I'm a peaceful Muslim, I'm a good Muslim, I'm not a terrorist, or sort of begin by peeling away those layers before you can sort of have any kind of parity in the conversation. And so that there's a few steps that have to be taken before Muslim participants feel like real partners. And I think how we can shift that dynamic is a real challenge for us organizationally in this sort of moment and in this culture, and not to be too optimistic in this moment, but I do think that there's been a shift between 10 years ago, 10 years after 9/11 and 20 years after 9/11. I feel like I read a lot more pieces in this anniversary that acknowledged the climate of Islamophobia and sort of acknowledged this toxic literacy, whereas I think 10 years ago, that awareness wasn't there, or at least wasn't played out in the media. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that assessment of the sort of 20-year mark versus the 10-year mark.
Oh yes, I would definitely agree with that observation, and but it's also a sad reality that the far right, or is going, not only that the right is going, or the right leaning attitudes are going here in the United States, but also in Europe. So Islamophobia is increasing, and it becomes more on the radar. People are understanding that maybe it's not the Muslim extremists who are the real threats, but it's domestic terror. It's it's people who are within the country who are afraid for a number of reasons of the other, of immigrants, of refugees. And so this is a global challenge. It's not just, it's happening on both sides of the Atlantic, as someone who has these ties to the country. And also, and so this needs to be addressed. And definitely literacy is a key piece. But the sad reality is Islamophobia becomes also more of a wider phenomenon, and it's deeply disturbing. And how do we address that as educators and as communities is a challenge.
Well, and I think of the context of the 10-year anniversary, right? It was 2011, it was the Obama presidency, it was winding down wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you think of what has occurred over the last year or last decade in American life, right? With the rise of ISIS to fill this power vacuum in Iraq and Syria, the presidency of Donald Trump, who during the campaign said, I think Islam hates us, right? And us that implicitly excises Muslims from the American population, the Muslim ban, right? So I think there's just an awareness that if we thought a decade ago we were on some glide path to pluralism and interreligious understanding, that illusion has dissipated over the last decade. And I think there's just a deeper cognizance, especially after January 6th, that the tensions that run through our society, and especially the ways that those get mapped onto prejudices against Muslims, that's not going away anytime soon. And I think that we're all grappling with that understanding as we mark this 20th anniversary.
In the next 20 years, do we have any predictions? I mean, like, it is something that I think about often, because I mean, I'm not a new parent anymore, but I'm a parent that's concerned about the next 20 years as my children become adults and have families of their own. I think what's hard to predict is, given the fast-paced nature of our global environment and the dissemination of misinformation, the echo chambers, the vitriol that comes out of it, it's hard to predict how people will self-identify and find meaning in their lives, whether they'll find meaning in a pluralistic way, in that they take curiosity about the religious others, or they develop views that are steeped in antagonism and hatred. The thing that concerns me is that if history is an example, I think that the next 20 years will be very similar to the past 20 years, in the sense that it's also an incredible transition period. And I'm speaking now as a member of the Jewish community, in that we're going to lose in the next 5 or 10 years Holocaust survivors. There is this move not just to preserve their memory, but the illiteracy regarding the Holocaust today is at really scary levels. Surveys show in the United States and around the world that it's not just simply Holocaust denial, it's Holocaust ignorance, that people don't even know that it happened, or that there's anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews. And so 40 years after 9/11, when we think about Islamophobia, and we think about some of the violence that was done against people who were perceived to be Muslim, and the children and the families that grew up in an environment of fear in this country, we have the propensity and the proclivity to forget these things. And so I do have a fear. On the other hand, where I see some potential for some real change, is that these digital natives really have access to so much information so quickly, and at least according to surveys, don't seem as quick to be as I don't know what, ethnocentric or racist is probably a strong word, but prejudice towards others that they don't understand. And so it's going to be an incredible transition. So I can't predict the future. I just would like all of us to act as if it's not going to be a good future, and to do our best to ensure that it gets better.
I really want to pick up the thread around technology. Like, I didn't have a cell phone 20 years ago when 9/11 happened. Like, I was and I just think about the world now, and the way that we're sort of, carrying around in our pockets things that are both tracking us all the time, and that allow us, like you said, to have access to all of this information, good, bad, and indifferent. And whether the capacity for society and the functioning to society to keep up with this technology and the sort of pace of technology is something that I really have questions about. And the possibilities, though, are also, to end on a positive note, good, right? So we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we're able to be together tonight on Zoom. We're able to have a conversation and see each other and be safe in our homes. And so I don't want to say all technology is bad. I'm not, I don't want to get in the good, bad technology trap here, but I do think that we have to have more serious societal conversations around the role of technology and the role that literacy around technology and using these tools has for our kids. And I do hope that our kids are more aware than some of us are.
I am deeply pessimistic about technology. I don't know that I can share that optimism. I mean, it's digital natives, has been put it, who are fueling QAnon conspiracy theories, right? And I look at the role that Facebook has played in, and WhatsApp have played in these massacres against Rohingya in Myanmar, Burma, right? And the ways that narratives get formed online and in social media that social media companies themselves aren't even paying attention to. Or I think of the oppression of the Uyghurs in Western China and the way that technology has become a kind of mode of totalitarianism there. So I guess I'm in a much more of a mode of technological despair, but I guess I also have younger kids who don't use all the same technology as others do.
Definitely. I also agree that at times, we end up in these social media bubbles, and it's very, very easy, to just defriend someone if they disagree with us, and just like basically create a bubble where we only, hear our own echoes. And I think that's the danger. We don't allow for what's the ethics of disagreement. How do we really cultivate a civic discourse? And we are trying to do this a little bit here at ICJS and modeling that to allow for a variety of voices and, to be heard. But I think this is something that we need to cultivate. I mean, we invent technology and we don't talk about the ethics about it, or we then wrestle with the aftermath or the implications afterwards. So something is invented and then we have certain impacts on our lives, negative, and then we are trying to do damage control. I think that's where I see the danger, these kind of like bubbles where people end up and not really talking to the other side. I don't know how to really address that, but that's one thing. I don't want to also give the impression that I'm, I said earlier that there have been, as horrific as these events were, we have these interfaith alliances, where people really understand that they really want to have a firsthand experience. They really want to build relationships. And it's really the dialogical model that Ben was talking about, that it takes each one of us to go and talk to someone who is different than us and to really make sure that we are all active in this and not expecting others to solve the problem. Yeah.
But I would also say that I agree with Matt's pessimism. I think there is the flip side of it is that, especially when it comes to religious bigotry, we have seen incredible organizing that has taken place through the technology to protect vulnerable citizens. I'm thinking from personal experience, getting a text saying there's going to be a protest at the airport protesting the Muslim ban, and being able to get several thousand people there to draw attention to a policy that's based on religious prejudice and bigotry, or getting information, Jewish communities sending out information quickly to say we want to build or Muslim communities or Christian communities saying we want to send people to mosques or synagogues or churches to show solidarity with one another. That these kind of events that grow organically through our technology actually gave us opportunities for dialogue that we couldn't have done without it. And so I think to Mike's question in the chat, right? So that can be a benign use when it's applied. I think the deeper existential problems of when your identity becomes interwoven into how you assess information and knowledge and wisdom from these quick quotations online, and the inability to be humble and to be wrong, or to not to lose a debate. I think we're losing that capacity in some way, because our skills in listening have
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think how do we cultivate the virtue of humility in an age where there is so much information and people think they know it all, right? I mean, so that's one challenge as well.
And I think, again, if we're starting to name theological virtues here, which is always a delightful turn in the conversation, I also think our religious traditions have something to say about truth and truth claims and when something is false or a lie. And I do think that there are moments like the protocols of Zion, as an example that Ben brought up earlier, where you can say something is pure propaganda and something is a lie. And I feel like there's a way in which we, in interreligious spaces as well as in religious spaces, need to sort of reclaim some of that, right? Obviously, you know, truth and heresy and various other things can be weaponized very easily as well. But there's a value in really talking about truth and knowledge and how you know something is true.
How much of the 9/11 tragedy is the result of power politics as opposed to religious fervor and that complicated interface of politics and religion? And the questioner poses the even more provocative, don't we misunderstand the attack by focusing on the religious as opposed to the political background of the hijackers? And as somebody who spent quite a bit of time on the political and religious background of the hijackers, I think there's some real insight in that question. I think one of the unanswered and unexamined questions that, especially in the first few years after 9/11, is what were Al-Qaeda's complaints? What were their causes? And what did they think they were doing on 9/11? And if you look at that, it really was about US international foreign policy. It was about US relations with Israel. It was about the US troops who were stationed at the time in Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries. And so I think there's this way that people wanted to kind of shore up and say, oh, they attacked us, or they attacked America, or they attacked the West, as opposed to actually looking at some of the real political and international political motivations, geopolitical motivations that were behind that, and attributing everything to religious fervor instead of understanding kind of that geopolitical context and the ways that America, in some ways, through destabilizing the region and instigating some of those conflicts, kind of fueled that cause of Al-Qaeda. So I do think there's something to that. Do others have thoughts on that?
I mean, I think it's always a both and situation. I don't think you can neatly separate out religion and politics, particularly in this instance. And also for understanding motivations in the framing of US policy interests as well. And so I think that if you try to make those clean breaks, I mean, like, no, this is only politics, or no, this is only religion, then I think you're not getting a full picture. And you really have to be willing to engage in that messy gray area that says yes to both. And is maybe a little bit uncomfortable in some of the gray spaces.
One of the things that struck me about our foreign policy as I tried to learn more about it is, you know, we go to war with Iraq and Afghanistan, and putting aside the politics of that, and also recognizing that none of the people were from those parts of the world, this sort of how religion started to play a role from the US point of view, people throwing out words like crusade, soldiers wearing patches that were traditional crusader patches on their uniforms, the proliferation of Arabic translations of the New Testament that soldiers were giving out in Iraq, or Pashtun translations in Afghanistan. And so the question then became, is this part of US foreign policy as a reified crusade, or are these individual soldiers and commanders or politicians that are using a war to advance a certain religious agenda within a much larger geopolitical framework? They're obviously open questions. And people analyze George Bush's speeches to that extent too. And so when you neatly separate them, you're going to have very neat answers. But when you see them operating them together, it doesn't lend itself to easy conclusions.
So there's a question in the chat about kind of the current situation with Afghan refugees and So part of it is about kind of interreligious, those of us who are committed to interreligious understanding what we could do to assist in their arrival. And the other part of the question though is that the widespread sympathy directed towards these Afghan refugees that hopefully will be integrating tens of thousands of them into American society. Is that an opportunity for greater acceptance of Islam and Muslims in the US?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to especially the religious communities who are stepping up. I personally, work with several Christian congregations in Alexandria, Virginia, who have assisted refugee families from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and they were mentoring them in terms of English language skills, driving them to doctor's appointments, Lutheran immigration services and refugee services, Catholic refugee services. This is a great example of religion as good, because religious communities do a great of work, charitable works, Muslim communities who are stepping up and really going beyond these 3 months of government support, trying to offer job positions, trying to offer their skills, mentoring families, many families offering their houses as temporary residences. So these are wonderful examples of religious communities stepping up, Christians, Jewish, Muslim communities. And we don't see that, of course, covered in the media, because this is good news. And so, and there are many ways, one beautiful thing I've seen a YouTuber that I'm following, an Afghan lady who is a Canadian, who lives in Canada, but she shared her Afghan recipes, and shared with the world that this is a small way of, when you meet an Afghan refugee person and say, I know how to cook aushak or different Afghan dishes, and know their language and their dishes. And this is just a simple but beautiful way to welcome them. And so these simple but powerful acts already go a long way. But also other things that, we as the receiving community can do in welcoming and supporting these new families. There is a huge opportunity with immigrant and refugee families, because they do have these transnational ties. As an immigrant child myself, they are still connected to their homes and their countries of origin, and they themselves can transform their countries of origin. So there is a huge opportunity for them to get to know American mainstream society, but also for Americans to understand Afghan culture, their backgrounds, and a huge learning opportunity on both sides, and many ways that we can, mutually enrich each other's lives.
To sort of further build on that, and since we kind of began this evening's program by doing a little personal sharing, I will say that my mother's family is from La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is this little Midwestern town on the Mississippi River, western part of the state. And a huge group of Afghan refugees are being sent to Fort McCoy, which is right near La Crosse, Wisconsin. And so I, through social media and various other things, have been following what's been happening in Western Wisconsin with the Afghan refugees. And similar to the story that Zainab was telling, the La Crosse Interfaith Shoulder to Shoulder Network has been organizing these amazing food drives and clothing drives and hospitality. And it's just been sort of wonderful to see on social media that my mother's, hometown is sort of rising to the occasion. And the sort of the flip side of this is that I've also seen in media various news agencies sending reporters to La Crosse to try to get the ugly story, to try to say, like, aren't you like upset about these, refugees coming into Western Wisconsin and all of this stuff? And I would say for the most part, the good folks of La Crosse have rejected that sort of outside storytelling that's coming in. And so it just sort of, again, highlights for me the complex nature of the media landscape and what we're consuming and how we're also crafting and structuring these stories.
If we were to think big about it, it seems like polling shows that Afghan refugees are being accepted. Maybe not in the types of numbers that we'd like to see, but they're doing better than other immigrant groups. And I wonder if we could push the envelope in having us rethink our whole immigration system and how we process refugees and immigrants. 3 months is not enough time to learn a language. It's not enough time to engage a culture. It's not enough time to really do a whole lot other than set yourself up for a life of disappointments. There are incredible people that come to this country, and 3 months is not enough time. And speaking from personal experience, having moved to another country, I needed at least a year before I was even able to go to university in that language. And so showing a little more compassion for our, and putting more resources, right? And then it's going to ask deeper questions about people who are already citizens and what should be afforded to us too in terms of that compassion. That's my political plug. I'm not suggesting one political party or the other, staying true to my nonprofit nature, but I think we have an opportunity to really make the society in terms of policy more compassionate.
I really resonate with that, Ben. And I think if you look at what many of these refugee agencies and even international aid organizations are proposing and expecting over the coming decades, there's going to be constant refugee crises and migrant situations as you have this destabilization just mushrooming out from a lot of the post 9/11 wars, but all kinds of other instability in the world as you have the climate crisis. And so I think if we could take this opportunity to rethink our system, rethink the values underneath our system for admitting and welcoming refugees, I think that would be a really great work that we could do. And I think that the positive feelings towards these Afghan refugees is actually a great opportunity for that. All right, I'm going to pose one last question, and I'm going to ask you to each have quick answers to it because I think it's a good question. How do you keep up the spirit of goodwill? How do you stay in it for the long haul?
I would say, I was actually just talking about this with another colleague of ours at ICJS today. Like there are ways in which our sacred texts, like the horrors that we're experiencing now are in some ways not entirely new. There have been other pandemics, there's been horrific war, there's been immigrants, there's been, the widows, orphans, all of these things. And so our religious traditions are resources for a lot of deep thinking around these topics and questions. And I was talking today about Pirkei Avot and the sort of sentiment that it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither is it your liberty to neglect it. As a rough translation, that you've got to, even if it's good work and it's not going to be completed, you got to keep at it.
I think it is, again, the religious tradition and the resources they speak to us to be proactive in the world, to be constructive, to be caretakers of this creation and do our best. There is a little story in the Islamic tradition that talks when a little ant is telling her community that she wants to go for pilgrimage to the Kaaba. And all the ants are laughing and saying, you with your little legs, you can't reach the Kaaba possibly ever. And she says, at least I will die on that path, right? So I think the way is the goal. That's how I see it. I, do my little part and my little effort, and the sincere intention is there. I might not reach the goal. I might not see the results in my lifetime, but at least I will die on that path. And that's, I'm content with that. And hopefully I pray that things will be better in the future.
At least what keeps me going is that when I become really overwhelmed by how small I am in the world and the universe, and sometimes my religious sources don't offer me this sort of comfort that I want in knowing that I'll die and that I'll die a second death and all of this. Second death meaning that like everyone who ever knew me will die and it'll be as if I never existed. I do know that like as Heather was saying, the work is never completed, and what we call tikkun, repair, it requires my work. I can plant a carob tree, but I'm never going to enjoy its fruits. And so my work in this world is to have a world full of those kinds of carob trees. And I don't know how they will play out. And I also won't live to actually enjoy the fruits of those labors because they weren't for me. And that makes me feel like it's definitely worth the work. I want to die on that path that Zainab had just described. And I don't want to complete the work.
One of the phrases from our new this year vision statement at ICJS is that we are striving for an interreligious society where friendship replaces fear. And for those of us who are trying to do this in the long haul, I think having friendships, having deep, genuine friendships across interreligious lines, friendships where you can have deeply honest conversations, friendships where you can laugh together, friendships where you can mourn together. I think that's what will keep us in it for the long haul, as opposed to just acquaintanceships or convenient friendships. This is one of many public programs that we're going to be having throughout the year, and especially this fall, as we do this work to disarm religious bias and bigotry, to build learning communities where religious difference is a powerful force for good. So you can get more information about that and sign up for our email newsletter if you're not already receiving those at our website, www.icjs.org. And we really hope that you'll join us for our next event. It's actually next week. We'll be talking with the hosts of the podcast Keeping It 101, who they're both religion scholars, and we're going to be talking about the role of public conversations about religion and whether religion is still relevant today. So that'll be on September 24th, and you can get info and registration for that at our website. And also on our website, you can donate to the work of the ICJS. We make these programs free for the public because we believe that this is an important public good that we're doing. We are a 501c3 educational nonprofit, and we rely on your community support. So we're grateful for your partnership. We're grateful for your working with us to build an interreligious society. So thank you again for coming. Hopefully we'll see you again next week and throughout this fall. And we hope that you and your family stay healthy and safe throughout this pandemic.